Good afternoon, my friends. What makes this latest discussion around the Detroit Lions so fascinating is that it isn't based on hype, bold predictions, or emotional opinions from fans. Instead, it comes from a much bigger picture that emerged after ESPN officially completed its ranking of the NFL's top 10 players at every position. When all of those rankings were put together and compared across every team in the league, something incredible stood out. The Detroit Lions didn't just rank near the top, they separated themselves from everyone else by an enormous margin, and once you look closely at the numbers, you begin to understand why expectations around this team continue to grow. The comparison became even more interesting after the rankings were organized into an overall talent score. Every player who appeared inside ESPN's positional top 10 earned points for his team based on where he ranked. The higher the ranking, the more points that position contributed. Even honorable mentions received a small amount of credit. When every position was added together, the Lions finished with an incredible total of 55 points. Now, think about that for a second. The next closest teams weren't just 1 or 2 points behind Detroit. They were 13 points behind. The Eagles, 49ers, Chiefs, Rams, Texans, and Seahawks all finished tied with 42 points, while Detroit stood alone at the top. That kind of gap is almost unheard of when you're comparing the most talented rosters across the NFL. But here's where the story becomes even more exciting. This isn't simply about having elite players. It's about when those players have reached this level of greatness. Take the safety position, for example. Detroit earned one of the highest scores in the league thanks to Brian Branch and Kirby Joseph. Only Baltimore finished ahead, while the Chargers matched Detroit's total. That's already impressive by itself, but the real headline is the age of those players. Branch is still playing on his rookie contract. Kirby Joseph is also extremely young, despite already beginning the next phase of his career. Instead of relying on aging veterans approaching the end of their prime, Detroit has one of the NFL's best safety groups built around players who are still developing. The same pattern appears at linebacker. Dan Campbell is already being recognized among the league's better players while still playing under his rookie contract. Compare that with other contenders around the NFL. Many of the linebackers leading those teams are established veterans who have already spent years in the league. Detroit's cornerstone at the position is still entering the prime of his career. Then you move to edge rusher. Aiden Hutchinson represents exactly what every NFL franchise hopes to build around. He is already considered one of football's premier pass rushers while still technically playing on his rookie deal. Around the league, many of the other elite edge players are older stars who have accumulated years of wear and tear. Hutchinson, meanwhile, still has some of his best football ahead of him. That trend continues almost everywhere you look. At offensive tackle, Penei Sewell remains one of the league's elite players despite still being remarkably young for someone already viewed as one of the NFL's best. Other contenders often rely on veteran stars who are approaching the later stages of their careers. Detroit's franchise tackle hasn't even reached that point yet. The same can be said at tight end. Sam LaPorta has already earned recognition among the NFL's top players at his position despite entering the league only recently. While other elite tight ends are dealing with major injuries or are already well into their 30s, LaPorta continues to establish himself as one of the brightest young stars in football. Wide receiver tells a similar story. Amon-Ra St. Brown continues to prove why he belongs among the league's elite, while Jameson Williams even earned honorable mention recognition. What's remarkable isn't simply their production, it's that this is actually considered one of Detroit's older position groups among its elite talent. Think about that for a moment. When your receiving core is viewed as one of the older strengths on the roster despite still being led by players firmly in their prime, it says everything about how young this foundation really is. The running back position follows exactly the same pattern. Jahmyr Gibbs ranked among the NFL's very best while still being one of the youngest stars at his position. Around the league, many of the elite running backs have already accumulated years of heavy workloads. Gibbs is only beginning what could become an outstanding career. Quarterback is really the only position where Detroit doesn't fit the same age profile. Jared Goff is naturally older than many of his teammates, but that actually strengthens the overall picture instead of weakening it. Quarterbacks often play their best football in their early 30s, meaning Goff is surrounded by an incredibly young core while operating during what many believe to be the peak years of his own career. Instead of trying to develop alongside inexperienced talent, he now leads one of the deepest young rosters in the entire NFL. When you step back and connect connect all of these pieces together, the overall message becomes impossible to ignore. The Lions aren't simply talented because they have one superstar carrying the roster. They have elite players spread across nearly every important position on the field, and most of those players haven't even reached the traditional peak years of an NFL career yet. That's what separates Detroit from many of the other contenders. Several championship caliber teams feature outstanding veterans who are slowly approaching the final chapters of their careers. The Lions, on the other hand, appear to have assembled a roster whose championship window could remain open for years if this young core continues developing together. And perhaps that's the biggest reason why this latest ranking has generated so much attention. It isn't just saying Detroit has great players today, it's suggesting that this team has built something sustainable, with elite talent already in place, and still improving rather than declining. So after seeing Detroit finish comfortably ahead of every other NFL team in this overall talent comparison, do you believe this young core truly has everything it needs to dominate the league over the next several seasons? Or do you think there is still one major piece missing before the Lions can fully capitalize on this incredible roster? The reason this discussion becomes even more important is because it completely changes the way we should look at Detroit's championship window. For months, one of the biggest debates around the NFL has been whether the Lions are approaching the end of their opportunity to win a Super Bowl. Some analysts have questioned whether this roster has already reached its peak, while others have suggested that Detroit needs to win immediately before its core becomes too expensive to keep together. But when you examine this collection of talent, that argument starts to lose a lot of its strength. The overwhelming majority of the players who placed among ESPN's top 10 at their positions are still 25 years old or younger, with only a handful slightly above that age. Outside of Jared Goff, this isn't a roster built around aging stars trying to squeeze out one last championship run. It's a team filled with players who are either entering their prime or haven't even fully reached it yet. That distinction matters because NFL success isn't only about assembling talent. It's about how long you can keep that talent performing at an elite level. Detroit isn't relying on players whose production might suddenly decline because of age. Instead, many of its biggest contributors should continue improving over the next several seasons. That creates something every franchise wants but very few actually achieve: stability. Think about how difficult it is to find just one elite player at a premium position. Now consider what Detroit has built: an elite quarterback, one of the league's best running backs, a top offensive tackle, a premier wide receiver, a young tight end already viewed among the NFL's best, a dominant edge rusher, one of the strongest safety combinations in football, an ascending linebacker. Every one of those positions represents a cornerstone that organizations spend years trying to find. When those pieces all exist on the same roster at the same time, you aren't simply talking about a playoff team anymore. You're talking about a foundation capable of competing with anyone. Another point that shouldn't be overlooked is that this level of talent doesn't happen by accident. A roster this deep requires years of successful drafting, player development, and roster construction. Elite players don't simply appear overnight. They have to be identified, developed, and placed into situations where they can maximize their abilities. Looking across the teams near the top of these rankings, one pattern becomes very clear. Nearly every organization with significant top-end talent is also known for having strong coaching. That's an important observation because great coaching and elite talent almost always go hand in hand. Players still need guidance, development, and systems that allow them to succeed. Detroit reaching this level reflects much more than individual performances. It reflects an organization that has consistently built around young players capable of becoming stars. Even more impressive is what happens when you account for adversity. One interesting point raised during this discussion is that even if you remove the production represented by Detroit's safety position because of injuries, the Lions would still remain the highest ranked team in this overall talent comparison. Their adjusted total would still exceed every other team included in the rankings. Think about what that says regarding the roster's overall strength. Many teams depend heavily on one or two elite players. If those players are unavailable, the entire roster suddenly looks much different. Detroit appears to have enough elite talent spread throughout multiple position groups that even removing one of its biggest strengths still leaves the Lions at the top. That kind of balance is incredibly difficult to build in today's NFL. Instead of relying on one dominant area, Detroit possesses quality throughout the roster. Offensively, they have proven playmakers at nearly every important position. Defensively, they feature impact players capable capable of changing games in multiple ways. That balance forces opponents to prepare for threats everywhere rather than focusing on stopping one individual. Looking ahead, that's exactly why expectations continue rising. If this roster stays healthy, there are very few obvious weaknesses compared to the rest of the league. The conversation shifts away from whether Detroit has enough talent and moves toward a much simpler question. Can this team consistently perform at the level its roster suggests? Based on these rankings, there's little argument remaining about the quality of the personnel. Detroit has already proven it belongs among the NFL's elite from a talent standpoint. The challenge now becomes translating that advantage into victories when the regular season begins. That's why so many people believe this season could become a defining moment for the franchise. The pieces appear to be in place. The young stars continue developing. The veteran leadership remains intact, and perhaps most importantly, this isn't a roster that appears close to running out of time. It looks like one that's still climbing. If these players continue progressing the way they have over the past few seasons, Detroit won't simply enter games believing it can compete. The Lions will enter many matchups expecting to have the better roster on the field. Only the games themselves will determine whether that expectation becomes reality. But one thing is becoming increasingly difficult to deny. The rest of the NFL is looking at Detroit differently now because the numbers suggest this isn't just another good football team. It may be the deepest collection of young elite talent currently assembled anywhere in the league. Now I want to hear from you. Do you believe these talent rankings accurately reflect where the Lions stand entering